Registration now.
What's the problem, officer?
The problem is, I'll tell you what the problem is. Your taillight's flickering.
Can I ask why you pulled me over for a taillight?
Because that's what I do. What are you doing in this neighborhood?
I'm a taxi driver, sir. Just dropped off a passenger.
Yeah, where's your passenger now?
I dropped him off about 30 minutes ago.
Step out of the vehicle now.
Officer, I need to understand what
You're
I'm being
being stopped because I said so.
License and registration. Now, the officer's voice cut through the silence of the cold night of November 15th, 2024, as his flashlight illuminated the interior of the taxi stopped on the deserted street. The driver, wearing a black cap and a hospital mask covering half his face, slowly reached for the glove compartment while keeping his hands visible, a calculated movement of someone who knew police protocol very well. Officer Derek Matthews had no idea that the black man sitting behind the wheel of that ordinary taxi wasn't just another driver working the night shift, but rather Captain James Morrison, an undercover police officer with over 20 years of service and responsible for supervising the entire Central Division of the Metropolitan Police. What happened in that traffic stop over the next hours would completely destroy Matthews's career and expose a pattern of racism so deep that it would shock the entire city and force a complete federal investigation into discriminatory practices within the department. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, tell me where you're watching from right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below, because this is one of those stories that everyone needs to see. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit that subscribe button right now, because what this racist cop faced when he discovered the driver's true identity will leave your jaw on the floor. This story has twists you won't believe, and every second of it was documented by the officer's own body camera, creating irrefutable evidence of what really happened on that freezing November night. Captain James Morrison was 45 years old and was a legend within the police department, known for his unwavering integrity and his commitment to real justice, not just justice on paper. He had worked in every possible division during his career, from street patrol to homicide investigations, and had risen through the ranks through pure hard work and unquestionable dedication. But in the last 6 months, Morrison had heard troubling rumors about certain officers in his division who were making discriminatory traffic stops, specifically targeting Black and Latino drivers in upper-middle-class neighborhoods. Complaints reached his office regularly, but concrete evidence was always lacking, because the officers knew how to write reports that seemed justifiable on paper, even when the stops were completely based on racial profiling. Morrison decided that the only way to discover the truth was to see it with his own eyes. So he created an elaborate plan that nobody in the department knew about, except the police chief himself. He would borrow a taxi from a friend who had a small transportation company, dress in regular clothes, and work as a taxi driver for several nights, driving through the areas where complaints were most frequent. The black cap hid part of his face and the hospital mask, something that was still common to see after the pandemic, covered the rest, ensuring that no officer would recognize him even if they stopped him. He installed his own hidden camera inside the taxi to capture any interaction, because he knew that if something happened, he would need evidence beyond his word against another officer's word. During the first 5 nights, Morrison drove for hours without any significant incident, picking up real passengers and taking them to their destinations while carefully observing how other drivers were treated by police. He saw patterns begin to emerge, saw cars with white drivers passing through checkpoints without being stopped, while cars with black drivers were signaled to pull over even when there was no apparent traffic violation. On the 6th night, November 15th, 2024, everything changed when he was driving down a quiet street in a predominantly white neighborhood around 10 o'clock at night, taking an elderly passenger home after a late medical appointment. Morrison wasn't speeding, didn't run a red light, didn't make any illegal turns. He was simply driving normally when he saw the red and blue lights turn on behind him in the rearview mirror, and immediately his heart started beating faster, because he knew this was exactly the moment he had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. Morrison calmly signaled and pulled the taxi onto the shoulder, his hands immediately going to the top of the steering wheel where they were completely visible through the window. The elderly passenger in the back seat, a white man with gray hair named Harold, seemed confused and a bit worried, asking in a low voice if there was any problem with the car. Morrison responded gently that everything was fine, that it was probably just a routine check, but inside his experienced police instincts were already analyzing every detail of the situation. He watched through the rearview mirror as Officer Matthews got out of the patrol car, adjusted his equipment belt, and walked slowly toward the taxi with his hand resting casually near his weapon, a posture that Morrison immediately recognized as someone who had already decided this stop was potentially dangerous before even interacting with the driver. Matthews's body camera was on and recording every second, just like the hidden camera Morrison had installed on the taxi's dashboard, creating two different perspectives of the same encounter that would soon become crucial evidence. Matthews knocked on the driver's window with his flashlight, an unnecessarily aggressive gesture that made Harold in the back seat give a small, startled jump. Morrison lowered the window slowly, keeping his hands always visible, and before he could even say good evening, Matthews was demanding license and registration with a tone that made it clear he wasn't there for a polite conversation. Morrison responded with professional calm, saying he would get the documents from the glove compartment and asking permission before moving his hands, exactly as any civilian should do during a traffic stop. Matthews gave an impatient nod of consent, but his flashlight continued pointing directly at Morrison's face, trying to see beyond the mask and cap, his eyes searching for anything that could justify the suspicion he had clearly already formed in his mind, based purely on the driver's skin color. As Morrison handed over his documents, he politely asked what the reason for the stop was, a completely legitimate question that any citizen has the right to ask. Matthews's response was vague and evasive, something about the taxi driving erratically, an allegation that Morrison knew to be completely false because he had driven with extreme care, staying exactly at the speed limit and following all traffic rules meticulously. Harold, the passenger in the back seat, immediately contradicted the officer, saying the driver had been extremely careful and that there was nothing wrong with the driving. Matthews looked at Harold with an expression of irritation, clearly not expecting a white passenger to defend a black driver, and said curtly that he was dealing with the driver and that the passenger should be quiet. The tone and words used by Matthews were already beginning to paint a clear picture of how he saw this situation, not as a legitimate traffic stop, but as an opportunity to exercise power over someone he considered inferior. Morrison maintained his perfect composure, something he had practiced for decades working in high-pressure situations, but inside, he was cataloging every protocol violation Matthews was committing. The officer had not provided a specific and articulable reason for the stop, had been unnecessarily aggressive from the first moment, and was now intimidating a witness who could contradict his narrative. Matthews took the driver's license and taxi documents and returned to his patrol car, presumably to check the system. But Morrison knew the officer was probably desperately searching for anything, any past infraction or pending warrant he could use to justify turning this into something more than an unjustified stop. The minutes dragged on as Harold muttered in the back seat about how ridiculous this was, and how he had never been stopped like this when he drove his own car through this same neighborhood dozens of times. When Matthews finally returned to the taxi, his expression was even more closed, clearly frustrated at not having found anything incriminating in the system. He returned the documents to Morrison, but instead of ending the stop there, he began asking a series of questions that had absolutely nothing to do with traffic or the alleged erratic driving he had mentioned. Where Morrison was originally from, how long he had been driving a taxi, if he had other jobs where he lived, invasive questions that were clearly designed to fish for information or intimidate. Morrison answered each question calmly and briefly, providing only the minimum necessary information, because he knew exactly what Matthews was doing, prolonging the stop without legal justification in hopes that the driver would get nervous or make some mistake. The temperature inside the taxi was dropping because it was a cold November night and the window was open, but Matthews didn't seem to be in any hurry to let the driver and his elderly passenger go on their way. And it was at this moment that the situation began to escalate in ways that not even Morrison had fully anticipated. Matthews suddenly completely changed his approach and demanded that Morrison get out of the vehicle, an order that had absolutely no legal justification based on the circumstances of the stop. Morrison calmly asked what the reason was for him to exit the car, pointing out that he had provided all requested documents and had committed no infraction. Matthews's response was loaded with hostility. He said he didn't need to give explanations, and that if Morrison didn't comply immediately, he would be charged with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Harold in the back seat was completely shocked, his voice trembling as he protested that this was absurd, that the driver had done nothing wrong, and that he was a witness to everything. Matthews turned abruptly to Harold and ordered him to also exit the vehicle, saying that if he continued interfering, he would be arrested for obstruction. The situation was rapidly transforming from an unjustified traffic stop into something much more serious, and Morrison knew that every passing second was being captured by the cameras, building an irrefutable case of abuse of power. Morrison made a calculated decision at that moment. He would cooperate completely with all of Matthews's commands, not because he was afraid or because he thought the officer was right, but because he wanted to give Matthews all the rope necessary to metaphorically hang himself. He opened the taxi door slowly, keeping his hands always visible, and exited the vehicle with deliberate and careful movements. Matthews immediately instructed him to turn around and put his hands behind his back, a position that any reasonable person would recognize as preparation for handcuffs, even though no accusation or crime had been mentioned. Harold was now out of the taxi as well, standing on the sidewalk with his 72 years, shaking both from the cold and from indignation, repeating several times that he knew lawyers and that this was completely illegal. Matthews completely ignored the elderly man while placing Morrison against the side of the taxi, doing a pat-down so aggressive that it felt more like an act of domination than a legitimate security procedure. During the pat-down, Matthews was making comments that clearly crossed the line of professionalism, asking sarcastically if Morrison thought he was smart wearing a mask to hide his face, insinuating that he probably had something to hide or was involved in criminal activities. Morrison didn't respond to the provocations, simply kept his breathing calm and steady, but mentally he was registering every word, every unnecessarily rough touch, every violation of constitutional rights that was occurring. The pat-down found absolutely nothing illegal. No weapons, no drugs, no contraband of any kind. Just the taxi keys, a wallet with legitimate identification, and a cell phone. Matthews seemed genuinely disappointed at not having found anything he could use to justify his behavior, but instead of admitting he had made a mistake and releasing Morrison, he decided to double down on his bad decision. The officer then informed that he would search the interior of the taxi, claiming he had reasonable suspicion that there could be contraband or illegal substances in the vehicle. Morrison, maintaining his voice calm but firm, clearly stated for the cameras that he did not consent to the search of the vehicle and that there was no probable cause for such action. He explained that transporting an elderly passenger from a medical appointment to home did not constitute suspicious activity, and that driving while black in a white neighborhood was not legal grounds for a search. Matthews responded with a cruel laugh, saying that Morrison seemed to know a lot about the law and asking if he was one of those people who watched videos on the internet thinking they knew their rights. The irony of this statement was not lost on Morrison, who in fact not only knew the law, but had trained hundreds of officers on the constitutional limits of searches and seizures during his career. Harold was now recording everything with his own cell phone, his hands trembling but determined to document every moment of this injustice he was witnessing. Matthews began searching the taxi methodically, opening the glove compartment, checking under the seats, searching the trunk, desperately looking for anything that could turn this disastrous stop into something justifiable. He found the hidden camera Morrison had installed and yanked it out abruptly, saying it was illegal to record police officers, a completely false claim that showed either his ignorance of the law or his willingness to lie blatantly. Morrison politely corrected him, explaining that it was perfectly legal to record interactions with police in public space, and that destroying or confiscating recording equipment without a warrant was itself a violation of rights. Matthews threw the camera onto the taxi seat forcefully, clearly frustrated because every word that came out of Morrison's mouth demonstrated a knowledge of law that most civilians didn't possess. The officer was beginning to realize he had chosen the wrong person to harass, but his pride and prejudice wouldn't allow him to simply admit the mistake and end the stop. So he continued digging a deeper and deeper hole for himself, having no idea how deep that hole really was. The search of the taxi revealed absolutely nothing illegal, leaving Matthews in an even more difficult position to justify his actions. He stood beside the vehicle for a long moment, clearly processing his limited options, while Morrison remained leaning against the taxi exactly as he had been instructed to do. Harold continued recording everything, his voice occasionally breaking the silence with comments about how this was absurd and how he had never witnessed such injustice in his life. Morrison could see the frustration growing on Matthews's face, the slow realization that he had transformed a simple traffic stop into a situation that could have serious consequences for his career. But instead of doing the smart thing and ending the encounter with an apology, Matthews decided to try one last tactic to save face. He began interrogating Morrison about where he was going before the stop and who the passenger was. Morrison responded with seemingly infinite patience, explaining that he was taking Harold home after a medical appointment, information that Harold immediately confirmed, offering to show his medical documentation if necessary. Matthews ignored Harold's offer and asked Morrison if he had any criminal record, a question designed to humiliate and intimidate, since the officer had clearly already checked the system and knew Morrison had no history. Morrison calmly responded that he had no criminal record and asked again if he was free to leave, since no infraction had been committed and no evidence of criminal activity had been found. Matthews hesitated, realizing that legally he had no basis to continue detaining Morrison, but his bruised ego and ingrained prejudice wouldn't allow him to simply let a black man walk away after questioning his authority. So he committed what would be his most fatal mistake of the night. He decided to arrest Morrison. The charge was as ridiculous as it was desperate. Matthews alleged that Morrison was being arrested for obstruction of justice and suspicious behavior, two vague terms that corrupt officers frequently use when they have no real justification for an arrest. Harold exploded in protests, shouting that this was completely illegal and that he had everything recorded, but Matthews silenced him with a threat of arrest as well. Morrison maintained his composure as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, tightened unnecessarily tight, another small act of cruelty that would be added to the growing list of violations. As he was being led to the patrol car, Morrison spoke calmly to Matthews's body camera, declaring his full name for the first time, Captain James Morrison of the Metropolitan Police Central Division, badge number 7231. The words came out of his mouth with crystal clarity, and the entire world seemed to stop for a moment, frozen in time. Matthews stopped completely, his hand still holding Morrison's arm, his brain clearly struggling to process what he had just heard. He let out a nervous laugh and said Morrison was lying, that he was trying to impersonate an officer to get out of the situation, but the confidence in his voice was beginning to waver. Morrison turned his head enough to look Matthews directly in the eyes and repeated his identification, adding that he was Matthews's supervisor's direct superior and that every second of this stop had been recorded not only by the officer's body camera, but also by his own hidden camera and Harold's phone. He calmly explained that he was conducting an undercover investigation into discriminatory traffic stops and that Matthews had just provided a perfect and completely documented example of the exact behavior being investigated. The color drained from Matthews's face so quickly that he appeared physically ill. His hands began to tremble, and he took several steps back as if he had taken a punch to the stomach. Harold, still recording, began to laugh with a mixture of relief and satisfaction, saying he knew there was something special about the driver from the way he handled the entire situation. Matthews was now in total panic, stammering apologies and trying to remove the handcuffs from Morrison with trembling fingers, repeatedly murmuring that he didn't know, that if he had known who Morrison was, he never would have done this. Morrison remained calm as he was released from the handcuffs, rubbing his wrists where the metal had left red marks, and then said something that cut deeper than any shout could have. He looked at Matthews and asked why that should make a difference, why the fact that he was a police captain should change how he was treated. If he were really just a regular taxi driver, would Matthews's actions have been acceptable then? The question hung in the cold night air, unanswered, because there was no good answer, and Matthews knew it as he stood there, realizing his career had ended at that exact moment, destroyed by his own prejudice and arrogance, captured on high-definition video. Morrison took his phone and made a quick call, his voice professional and controlled as he reported the situation to the police chief, who was already waiting for updates on the undercover operation. Matthews stood a few meters away, completely paralyzed, listening to Morrison describe every detail of the illegal stop, the pat-down without probable cause, the non-consensual search of the vehicle, and the unfounded arrest. The police chief instructed Morrison to remain at the scene and informed him that he would immediately send supervisors and the Internal Affairs Division to properly document everything. Harold, who was still recording, asked Morrison if he was okay, if he needed anything, treating him now not just as his driver, but as someone who had just gone through a traumatic experience despite his position of authority. Morrison thanked Harold for his concern, and especially for documenting everything with his phone, explaining that the testimony of an ordinary citizen would be crucial for the case, because it proved this wasn't just about police investigating police, but about citizens' rights being violated. Matthews finally tried to speak, his voice coming out in a hoarse whisper as he tried to form some kind of explanation or defense for his actions. He began saying he'd had a difficult day, that he was under pressure, that he wasn't thinking clearly, all the typical excuses people use when caught doing something terrible. Morrison interrupted him calmly but firmly, saying that a bad day doesn't justify racism, that work pressure isn't an excuse to violate someone's constitutional rights, and that not thinking clearly is exactly why officers receive extensive training on when and how they can legally detain citizens. He explained that Matthews had multiple opportunities to simply end the stop when it became clear there was no infraction, but instead, he chose to escalate the situation repeatedly, and those choices revealed something much deeper than just a momentary lapse in judgment. Matthews lowered his head, unable to maintain eye contact, knowing that every word from Morrison was true and that there was no possible defense for what the cameras had captured. 15 minutes later, 3 patrol cars arrived at the scene, along with an unmarked vehicle from which Lieutenant Sarah Chen emerged, one of the most respected officers in the Internal Affairs Division. She greeted Morrison with professional respect, referring to him by his rank, and then turned to Matthews with an expression that made it clear she was deeply disappointed but not surprised. Chen informed Matthews that he was being immediately placed on administrative leave while a complete investigation was conducted, and that he needed to surrender his weapon, badge, and body camera at that moment. Matthews handed over his equipment with trembling hands, seeming to have aged 10 years in the last 30 minutes, and was instructed to get into one of the patrol cars that would take him back to the station to begin the formal interrogation process. Before Matthews got in the car, Morrison said one last thing that would echo in the officer's mind for a long time. He said he hoped Matthews would use this moment to truly reflect on his prejudices and how they harmed not only his victims, but also the integrity of the entire police department. Harold was interviewed extensively at the scene by Internal Affairs investigators, his testimony and recording being officially documented as evidence. He described everything he had witnessed with impressive detail for someone his age, from the moment they were stopped without reason to the absurd arrest and the final revelation of Morrison's true identity. The investigators thanked Harold for his willingness to speak and for having the presence of mind to record the interaction, explaining that civilian witnesses were extremely valuable in cases of police misconduct because their credibility couldn't be questioned as biased. Harold said he was happy to help and that he wouldn't be able to sleep at night if he didn't do everything in his power to ensure justice was served, that he had lived long enough to see too much injustice in the world and was tired of staying silent. He was finally released to go home in another taxi provided by the department, but not before exchanging phone numbers with Morrison and making him promise to keep him informed about the case. Morrison spent the next 2 hours at the scene and then at the station, giving his own detailed statement about everything that had occurred during his 6 nights working undercover as a taxi driver. He provided all the recordings from his hidden camera, showing not only the interaction with Matthews, but also several other less severe cases of differential treatment he had observed during previous nights. The data was devastating, showing a clear pattern of racial discrimination in traffic stops in that division, with Black and Latino drivers being stopped at disproportionately high rates compared to white drivers in the same area. The investigation Morrison had initiated was already generating results beyond Matthews's case, identifying at least 4 other officers whose stop patterns strongly suggested racial bias. The police chief called an emergency meeting for the next morning with all commanders and announced there would be a complete review of traffic stop procedures throughout the entire department, making it clear that the behavior captured that night would not be tolerated under any circumstances and that systemic changes were needed immediately. News of the incident spread through the police department before dawn even broke, with officers whispering in the hallways about how Matthews had stopped and arrested Captain Morrison himself without knowing who he was. Some officers expressed genuine shock, saying they never imagined Matthews would cross so many ethical and legal lines all at once. Others, however, fell into embarrassed silence, knowing they themselves had made questionable stops based on racial profiling, and were now terrified that Morrison's hidden cameras might have captured their own inappropriate conduct during those 6 nights. The police union was in an impossible position. Traditionally, they would defend any officer accused of misconduct. But when the victim was a respected captain from their own department and the video evidence was so clear, there was no credible defense they could mount. The union president issued a carefully crafted statement saying they supported full investigations of all allegations and believed in due process. But even this neutral statement was met with skepticism by those who knew the case against Matthews was indisputable. The story leaked to the media the next morning, and within hours became a national headline, with the dramatic title proclaiming that a black police captain had been arrested by a racist officer during an undercover investigation into racial discrimination. News channels repeatedly showed the recording from Matthews's body camera, showing the unjustified stop, the aggressive pat-down, the illegal search of the vehicle, and finally, the shocking moment when Morrison revealed his true identity. The public reaction was immediate and furious, with people from all walks of life expressing outrage on social media, demanding not only that Matthews be fired, but also criminally prosecuted for his acts. Civil rights activists organized protests outside the Central Station, carrying signs that read, "If they treat a captain like this, imagine ordinary citizens," and "Racism in uniform is not protect and serve." The pressure on the department and the city was intense and growing, with each passing hour bringing more attention and more demands for justice and reform. Quick question for you watching right now. Have you witnessed or experienced differential treatment by police based on race? Type yes or no in the comments, because these experiences matter and need to be heard. Morrison's story resonated so deeply because it validated what countless Black and Latino people had been saying for years about their interactions with police, that no matter their education, their profession, or their behavior, skin color alone was enough to make them suspects in the eyes of certain officers. Harold gave several interviews to news stations, his voice trembling with emotion as he described what it was like to watch an innocent man be harassed and arrested simply for existing in a white neighborhood at night. He said the experience had opened his eyes in ways that decades of news stories and articles never had, because it's one thing to read about racial injustice and completely another to witness it personally and see someone's humanity being denied right in front of you. Matthews was formally interrogated by Internal Affairs 3 days after the incident, accompanied by his union lawyer who seemed to know he was fighting a losing battle. During the interrogation, Matthews tried several different narratives to justify his actions, first claiming he genuinely thought the taxi was driving erratically, but investigators pointed out that no reasonable officer would consider what was on the recordings as erratic driving. Then he tried to claim Morrison seemed nervous and suspicious, but again, the recordings showed Morrison being extraordinarily calm and cooperative throughout the entire interaction. Finally, when pressed about why he escalated the situation to an arrest when there clearly was no crime, Matthews broke down emotionally and admitted through tears that he simply didn't like Morrison's attitude, how he knew his rights and wasn't intimidated. This admission was devastating because it revealed the arrest wasn't based on any reasonable suspicion of crime, but rather on punishing someone for daring to question Matthews's authority, and the fact that this someone was a Black man only made the abuse of power even more flagrant. The Internal Affairs investigation worked with unusual efficiency. motivated both by the clarity of evidence and intense public pressure. They reviewed all of Matthews's body camera footage, all of Morrison's recordings, Harold's video, and interviewed at least 20 witnesses, including other drivers who had been stopped by Matthews in previous months. The pattern that emerged was undeniable. Matthews had made dozens of questionable stops throughout his career, with a percentage that was statistically impossible to be coincidence involving non-white drivers. Several of these previous stops resulted in complaints that were filed away or minimized by supervisors who didn't want to deal with the paperwork or implications of admitting they had a racist officer in their ranks. Investigators discovered emails and text messages between Matthews and other officers that contained racist jokes and derogatory comments about minority communities, creating a portrait of someone whose racism wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a core feature of his worldview. After 2 weeks of intensive investigation, Internal Affairs presented their findings in a 140-page report that recommended Matthews's immediate termination and referral of the case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges.